Hello and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby and I will be your driver on this journey. Tonight I wanted to do one out there for the chess historians where I cover some really interesting chess games in it of themselves, but also these chess games have very interesting stories behind them. They were very controversial and there are still arguments to this date about many of them. So most chess players and even some non-chess players probably know that these World Championship matches can get a little bit crazy. In particular, of course, the Bobby Fischer-Boris Spassky match of 1972 is probably the most famous chess match ever played. And there were all sorts of crazy antics, Bobby Fischer making sort of ridiculous demands, getting forfeited for a game and playing very badly in the second one. But tonight I'm not going to cover any Bobby Fischer games because I feel like those have been done to death. So hopefully you guys enjoy these other controversial chess games played in World Championship matches throughout history. To start off with here, I wanted to go very, very, very old school, all the way back to the days of Emanuel Lasker against Karl Schlechter. Of course, these two incredibly talented players at the time were chess players, yes, but this early on, in fact, the players had different professions as well. Chess was not big enough really to make it a full career, even at the highest level. And this last game between the two in their match is really interesting because actually Lasker, the defending champion, was down a full point heading into the final game. Of course, by today's standards, Schlechter would only need a draw in order to secure victory in the match. However, as we'll see in the game, Schlechter played very, very crazy chess, very wild chess, risky chess, when perhaps if truly all he needed was a draw, that wouldn't have been the case. And this has led to a ton of speculation as to whether the match actually had some very strange conditions where Schlechter perhaps needed to be up by 2 points in order to take the title. So why don't we go through the game? I will tell you, there is no definite answer to this. People still speculate to this day. And maybe after seeing the game, you guys in the chat will come to your own conclusions, whether or not you think either Schlechter just played a bad game, or if perhaps he was motivated by this rule that he needed 2 points in order to win the match. Let's jump into it here. Lasker had the white pieces and started with the move d4. We have d5, c4, and c6 arriving at the Slav. And then just a side note here, I actually found this game on Chess Games. That's where I usually just search up my games for these types of lectures. And Chess Games actually had some interesting notes by Capablanca. And for those Slav players out there, Capablanca officially has stated in the notes of this game that e6 is better than the Slav. Hate to break it to you, Capablanca thinks e6 just better than c6. The more you know. Anyways, the game continued with knight f3, knight f6, e3, and then g6. And so this is the first interesting decision in the opening that I did want to mention. So generally, Slav players do occasionally bring this bishop out to g7, but it has to be with a very, very specific idea. Now, why is that? And what is the idea associated with bishop g7? Well, I'm going to give you guys in the chat room a few moments to think about it, and we're going to go through the next few moves, which is just going to be normal development. But while I go through these, definitely, guys, think about bishop g7 and what idea has to be connected with it for this move to make sense. Okay, let's move on. We have knight c3, bishop g7, the natural move, bishop d3, and kingside castles. Now, so far, this is a pretty theoretically normal position. This has been reached plenty of times, and white does tend to just castle kingside. From here, there are various ideas, including bishop g4, h3, for example, and trading off these guys, as well as taking on c4, as well as just developing normally. But in this game, Lasker actually opts to play this strange-looking move, queen to c2, rather than castles. And this is sort of part of, I think, the argument as to why perhaps this 2-point rule wasn't in effect, because while later in the game, perhaps, it looks as though Schlechter is the one playing sort of wild and crazy, unnecessarily, which would suggest that he needed a full point to take the title. Lasker himself is also definitely leaning into complications, which definitely suggests he was not going to be happy with the draw either, which is what makes this game so interesting. Schlechter continued with the slightly strange-looking knight to a6, and I don't hate this move at all. It's actually just aimed at knight b4 very directly, and this is going to be a threat that white has to deal with. And now after a3, chat room, I'm curious if you guys have come up with the key idea associated with bishop g7. Now is definitely the time to play it for black, and if he doesn't find this move, he is going to end up just a little bit positionally worse, as we will see momentarily. So, what idea has to be combined with bishop g7? What do you guys think? How do we activate this bishop on g7? I'll give you guys just a moment to think. So yeah, Danilo in the chat is along the right track. You need to open up these dark squares, because if you let this pawn sit on d4, the fact of the matter is this bishop's going to be pretty useless, in fact, on g7. It's just going to be looking at an incredibly solid, incredibly strong d4 pawn, and it's never really going to see any activity. So yes, occasionally you'll see black go for ideas of e5, but especially with the way he's developed his pieces here, e5 is definitely not going to be so easy to achieve. And for that reason, the correct move in this position is actually to play the move c5. You counterattack like this using the extra support of this knight on a6, and this is the manner in which black can try and chip away at this powerful d4 pawn. And if black doesn't find this idea, well then he'll essentially be playing with a very, very poor piece on g7, as we'll see later in the game. In fact, Schlechter does not play the move c5, instead opting for d takes c4. White, of course, recaptures, and then black plays the interesting idea of b5. And this is something that you'll occasionally see in plenty of QGD positions and some Slav positions. Black captures on c4, forcing white to waste a tempo, and then takes b5 with tempo as well, giving his bishop the b7 square. White retreats back to d3, and now, once again, believe it or not, black's best try is to play the move c5. Despite this pawn on b5 being a little bit weak after the idea of b5, black absolutely must rip open this central diagonal, and even more importantly now, get rid of his pawn on c6, which is going to be hampering his other bishop as well. Understandably though, Schlechter was not so ready to give up his b5 pawn, instead going for the move b4. Of course, now the issue with this is not actually the natural a takes b4 when you would get forked, but the move knight a4. And now c5 is going to be very, very difficult to come by, and Lasker definitely already has a very solid opening advantage here. Pawn takes a3 was played, pawn takes a3, and now bishop b7. And once again, really, Schlechter perhaps in this game being a bit too materialistic. After bishop b7, it's very clear that this bishop is just a horrible, horrible piece if this pawn on c6 isn't removed. And so once again, c5 was going to be the right idea. You need to open up this diagonal, and you need to open up this diagonal as well. Here, in fact, it is just a full pawn sacrifice after takes, takes, and takes. But we are now at the point in the game where black would rather not have this pawn on c6 at all than keep the pawn and have it be in the way of his own pieces. In the game, though, bishop b7 was chosen, and rook b1 is a very, very nice move, pressuring this bishop on b7, also indirectly pressuring the knight on a6 by threatening to remove its defender. Queen c7 is natural to defend the bishop and defend against this threat. Knight e5 is chosen, another perfectly natural move to apply more pressure to c6. But once again, black needs to take the opportunity to play the move c5 before he sort of just gets crushed. In the game, knight h5 was chosen, and now we see that this bishop is sort of just desperately trying to trade itself off for this knight on e5, which, if you're familiar with the dark squared bishop in the QGD or the Slav, generally it can do a bit better than trading itself off for this knight, or at least it can force it under more favorable circumstances. And now, chat room, once again, I wanted to ask you guys what you think white should do. How should white respond to this idea of knight h5? There's actually a variety of very reasonable responses here, and I'm curious to see which one the chat room is leaning towards. What do you think? And the chess historians are definitely in the chat now, as well as the German speakers. Yeah, my knowledge on Schlechter's name is quite limited. I do know that he was a doctor, but again, I'm a better chess player than chess historian, and I'm not actually that good at chess, so that's saying something. So Manny has my favorite idea in these kinds of positions. It's clear that our opponent is aiming to sort of capture on e5, and I want to sort of discourage this idea. So the move f4 is very natural, very reasonable to me. Now, if bishop takes e5 were ever to be played, we could actually take back with our choice of pawns, and there is a pretty reasonable argument for taking back with either. But I do like just solidifying our center here, and no matter which pawn we recapture with, I like the fact that it is supported from behind by another pawn. The f-file might become useful, or in the event that we capture like this, the d4 square might be useful to us as well, along with some ideas of opening up this diagonal completely. In the game, though, Lasker chooses another really interesting move. Of course, castling is perfectly fine for white, and perhaps castling is just best, along with some ideas of f4 to follow. But Lasker goes for the initiative with the move g4. And this is a rather interesting idea. And I think this move, once again, to talk about the actual controversial points of this game, sort of hint at the fact that perhaps Lasker was really the one pressing for victory in this match, perhaps at all costs. Moves like g4 certainly would suggest this. Whereas so far, Black, I think, if anything, has been playing more conservatively, despite what those those sort of conspiracy theorists will call them, will say, where they describe Schlechter as sort of playing all out for a victory in this game. So far, I think in the opening especially, Schlechter chose a fairly conservative approach. But okay, after g4, we do see bishop takes e5, and now I think Lasker makes a pretty serious mistake. I think best here is to just take off this dark squared bishop, again taking with the d-pawn, and after knight g7, once again you have ideas of f4, either immediately or following kingside castles. Of course, this pawn cannot be captured immediately, thanks to the threat to the bishop. So something like castles, followed by f4, and I think white has a very reasonable advantage. In the game, though, Lasker chose, interestingly, to take on h5, and his idea here was to just totally break down the light squares around the black king, which is an interesting idea, especially with this bishop sort of out of play over here on the b7 square, but we'll see perhaps it's not the most accurate. Bishop back to g7 was played, saving the piece. We have h takes on g6, h takes on g6, and now the interesting move, queen c4 by white. And this, of course, is a move that creates two threats. Number one is taking advantage of the pin on the f-pawn in front of black's king, and number two is actually the threat to capture on b7 and capture on a6 to follow, winning two pieces for the rook, which would be a slight edge to white. But once again, chat, I'm interested to see if you guys can come up with a saving idea for black. At this point, black has had a pretty tough position to this point in the game, with this bishop being so hemmed in and this bishop not being too useful. But now was actually black's chance to try and at least equalize here. So what's the idea? What is the idea? Okay, if you guys at home don't have it yet, go ahead and pause the video. Of course, the idea is the same as it has been for the past 20 moves for black. He has to play the move c5, opening up the bishop and chipping away at the dark squares. Now, especially, even though it may end up costing black, again, some material, it's of the utmost importance to activate these bishops before, the end comes around black's king. So Of course, the move rook takes b7 wouldn't quite be working. Queen takes b7 is gaining a tempo on the rook, but white can start with the move rook g1, pressuring this g6 pawn. Black should play e6 to break the pin, and now after rook b7, queen b7, queen a6, bishop a6, c takes d4, and it's true that white gets 2 pieces for the rook in this case, but he also gets to break down this white center and this white control over the dark squares in the center, activating his remaining pieces, and there's plenty of open files for the rooks to play on. And I honestly almost prefer to be black. Maybe I would prefer to be black, although it is very, very close here. White with the bishop pair definitely has a lot of activity if he can manage to coordinate. But once again, Schlechter was unwilling to part with the material, we'll say, even though materially I think just point-wise it would be even after c5. Unwilling to take this risk, he plays the move bishop c8, just defending the bishop from the threat of capture. Now, of course, if the move bishop takes g6 were to be played, Schlechter has prepared this idea of bishop g6 when he would be able to capture back on g6, perhaps. For example, queen takes a6 and f takes g6. And even here, Schlechter would be down a pawn, but he would have removed white's powerful light-squared bishop, and he would have left himself with the bishop pair. And this position actually isn't too bad for black at all. In the game, though, Lasker tried to improve on this by playing the move rook to g1. And now, once again, I think it is, in fact, Lasker being the one who's taking a bit too many risks here. Of course, rook g1 adds more pressure to g6, but leaves behind this h2 pawn. And black here would have, in fact, been rewarded for some bravery by taking on h2, because after rook takes g6, really it looks scary around the black king, but with 3 pieces not really participating in the attack yet, black is going to be doing okay here. You might have to find some critical moves like bishop to e6, and you might have to realize that after scary stuff like this, king h8, your king is actually not getting killed here with black. You have some very nice pressure on this f-pawn, in fact, and like I said, these pieces not really contributing to the attack. That's not to say that white is like busted in this line. It's still going to be very, very scary, like I said, but with counterplay with this queen on h2, that's sort of what black needed to go for here. Instead, the move queen a5 check was played, and again, we see after queen a5, queen d5, Schlechter does seem to be playing a rather conservative game, and this has been consistent so far through the first 20-some moves. I think Schlechter is, in fact, despite what people say, in my opinion, I think Schlechter is very much playing to survive this game, not playing necessarily to win, but playing to survive. The game continued with rook to c1, adding more pressure to the c6 pawn, and we see this bishop come back to b7 now by Schlechter. And once again, the c6 pawn is the trouble for black here. Should have played c5 while he had the chance, and then should have played c5 even when he didn't have the chance anymore. You just had play c5 to activate these pieces. Queen c2 was Lasker's choice, setting up for some bishop c4 threats. Queen h5 to step out of these moves. And now it is, in fact, Lasker who initiates the sacrifice of material. And once again, it's Lasker who tries to make the game more interesting and tries to play the game for a win. If Lasker were perhaps content with the draw, you might have seen something like queen back to c4 even, when maybe black would play queen d5, and we would have some kind of a draw. Now that's sort of a stretch because black can play better moves here. But bishop takes g6 was played by Lasker, and I think this is not the move of a man trying to draw this chess game. I think this is definitely Lasker not hoping for some kind of perpetual, but hoping to find checkmate. And we'll see that despite this idea, Schlechter does manage to survive the onslaught initially. Perhaps better for Lasker, by the way, rather than bishop takes g6 immediately, might have been the tempo-gaining queen b3, hitting this bishop on b7. And if black, for example, were to try to defend with something like bishop back to c8, well, this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging. Once again, rook b8 would be playable as well, but now rook takes g6, and Of course, this bishop has no discoveries with only these two retreating moves available to it, and I do think white is pretty significantly better here. The problem with the immediate bishop takes g6 is white might have a comfortable position if f takes g and queen b3 with check is allowed to be played, but black does not necessarily have to capture this bishop on g6. And in fact, we see the move queen takes h2 come on the board, gaining time against this rook on g1. Not only gaining time, but this rook is actually unable to step forward to a square like g3, because then, of course, after fg6, if you try to repeat this line, look out, because you're suddenly getting checkmated on f2. So in order to make this sacrifice on g6 work, white now has to play a very awkward move, rook f1. This is not sort of the crushing attack that you hope for when you play a move like bishop takes g6. Now black does in fact capture on g6. White continues with this tactic, queen b3 check, rook f7, queen takes b7. And now black suddenly plays a good move, rook a to f8, leaving this knight temporarily hanging on a6, but getting pressure against the pawn on f2. And in fact, this does work out for black. If you were to try to capture on a6, rook takes f2, it's just going to end the game rather quickly. Rook f2, for example, and queen g1 is a fairly unstoppable threat. If you go queen c8, this is sort of the only way to stop it, I think. Of course, though, you leave this bishop on d2 hanging, and the white king is not going to survive the game. So rook a f8 is a severe enough threat that white cannot capture this knight, and instead queen b3 is played, of course, pinning the rook to the king. King h8 is very natural by Schlechter to open up this rook's attacking possibilities again, and Lasker finds the only move, f4, to stay in the game. Anything else, and black just comes crashing through on the f-file. And now, once again, it does start to appear that Schlechter is playing some very, very active chess all of a sudden, but I think it's more out of necessity than choice in this case. Here Schlechter plays the very natural move g5, and if black doesn't start going for things like g5, he'll start to feel like this knight on a6 is very out of play, this bishop is sort of dead on g7, and white would be able eventually to reconfigure his king and his other pieces to be a bit more coordinated. Of course, black also playing with 4 isolated pawns. Endgames are not really going to be enviable here. Black has to sort of make a push for white's king. So g5 was played. Queen d3 is Lasker's response, centralizing the queen, defending the rook, and sort of just solidifying the position. G takes f4, again very natural. E takes f4. We see a check by Schlechter. King e2, a check by Schlechter again. And now note that it is not Lasker who tries to repeat, but in fact, Lasker is happy to play on with the move rook f2, not accepting any kind of repetition. Queen h5 check, rook f3, knight c7. So once again, it ends up being Lasker in this case, being the one who declines any kind of repetition, any kind of draw, and it's Schlechter who might be hoping to get out of the game with a repetition. In this case, after knight to c7, Lasker tried to snatch this pawn off on c6. This is something you'll see strong players do throughout history and even today. When they feel like they might be in a bit of trouble, you'll often see them just sort of grab material like this and say, all right, I might be in trouble, my king might be weak, but if I survive it, gosh darn it, I'm going to be up a pawn. And then you'll have to deal with that. It just applies a bit more pressure to the opponent in many cases, even psychologically, if not over the board. Knight b5 is black's response. This was his idea to put pressure on d4. Rook c4, and now rook takes f4 is the big sacrifice by Schlechter. And I think it's this move that gets a lot of people thinking that Schlechter was very much playing for a win in this game. But once again, from my analysis of the position, yes, the sacrifice might not be necessary, but I also think it was perhaps Schlechter looking to simplify the position. You know, up to this point, we're 35 moves into the game. Schlechter has been on the back foot for the majority of that, and he's only now starting to attack the white king. And just looking at the position, you know, Lasker has captured a pawn. Lasker is currently up a pawn, and I feel like in Schlecter's shoes here, that's a tongue twister, you might start to think, hey, if I don't attack this guy, I'm going to lose this endgame. Pretty horribly, in fact. And I think that is a perfectly reasonable justification of the move rook takes f4. sacrificing the exchange, but it simplifies the position quite a bit. It gives black some very, very specific, difficult-to-meet threats right away, and it puts Lasker definitely on the defensive. And perhaps Schlechter was thinking, I don't know this for sure, but perhaps he was thinking, you know, okay, rook takes f4, and probably there will be a perpetual somewhere along the way. In the game, though, after rook takes f4, bishop takes f4 is played, rook takes f4, the natural follow-up. Rook c8 check is important by Lasker, temporarily discoordinating the black pieces by drawing this bishop back, keeping this rook sort of pinned up, even though this rook itself is also pinned. And now king f2 by Lasker is a fantastic move. He unpins this rook, applies pressure to the bishop on f8, and now Schlechter has to find some only moves in order to keep the game in the balance. Queen h2 check was correct, king to e1, and now unfortunately for Schlechter, he gives the wrong check. Queen h4 check would have maintained the balance when white has nothing better than to start repeating moves here. Check, 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 and the game might end in a draw. Unfortunately, though, for Schlechter, he chose queen h1 check rather than queen h4 check, and now, of course, white can continue the game and play for a win with the nice move rook f1, escaping from any type of perpetual check, and, well, yeah, that's just the main idea, escaping from any kind of perpetual check. Queen h4 check was now played by Schlechter, but it's too little too late. The king can now run to this side of the board. If queen h2 were to be played, the simple king d1 or king c1 are both perfectly playable when there are no more checks to this king. Well, sorry, I guess you can give queen h5 check, but then after this, there are no more checks to the king. Queen h6 isn't quite in time because king b2, and the king can actually run to the corner probably. King b3 would be a little ambitious with knight takes d4 hanging, but to the corner where it will find safety. Note that this line would not have worked if queen h4 check would be played here. Just to examine, if the king tries to step to d1 here, then after queen h1, of course rook f1 is not playable because black has an extra defender on the f1 square. In the game, though, we see queen h2, queen h1, the fatal mistake. Now after queen h4, king d2, and white is better. Rook takes f1, queen takes f1, and the pressure on this bishop is going to be a bit too much. Queen takes d4, now queen d3, queen f2 check, king d1, knight d6, and rook c5. At this point, of course, the game is still very complicated, but I will say from this point forward, white has an advantage and maintains that advantage throughout. If black started trying to check again, of course, white would be able to eventually escape these checks. For example, king c2, knight d4 check, king b2, queen f2 check, we'll say. Although is queen f2 wrong for some reason? I don't know, maybe. King c3, knight e2 check, king b4, and white can run to the safety of these three pieces, which do an effective job of covering his king from most attacks. In the game, though, we saw knight d6, rook c5. This bishop comes into play, attacking the white king, rook d5, king g8, knight to c5. The king runs up the board, bishop g7, now knight e6, and Lasker starts to simplify the position. Schlechter gives queen b2 check, king a4, and now after king f7, we do see the bishop come off the board, and the play starts to approach just a winning position for Lasker. Of course, these types of endgames are very, very difficult to play over the board. You're going to see a ton of mistakes in these types of endgames where both kings are just so wildly open with queens on the board, but of course, white should always be preferred with the major piece against the knight in this case. Queen b3 was Lasker's choice, setting up some discovered check possibilities. King e8, Lasker gives another check and snags a pawn. Queen g4 check, queen d4, more checks, the king runs back, king a2, and Lasker keeps his king safe and slowly but surely makes threats against the enemy king. This knight, of course, was pinned. Queen c2 check now forces the queens off the board, and this is a trivially winning endgame, with the white king coming up the board, and Schlechter resigns the game here. So all in all, this controversial game was sort of the most surprising to me. I'd always heard of this game as being, sort of Schlechter going crazy, trying like these absurd things just to avoid a draw. But from my analysis, I really do think it was just a case of Lasker being the one seeking complications, and Schlechter, if anything, trying to play a bit too conservatively. That's the impression that I personally got from the game. You're free to disagree with me on that one, but from my analysis, I think it's just a case of Lasker playing very, very well in what I think was a must-win situation. Of course, that's up for debate. People still speculate to this day, was this 2-game rule in effect, 2-point lead necessary for Schlechter to take the title? And my opinion is probably not, judging from this chess game. Of course, there are probably historians out there that know a lot more about the context than me, but from the chess game alone, I'm going to have to side with the Lasker fans on this one and say, I think he just played a good game of chess. Okay, with that one out of the way, I want to move along to another World Championship match, this one happening a lot more recently than Lasker Schlechter, and that is a match between Viktor Korchnoi and Anatoly Karpov. So this match happened in 1978, actually, and it was only 6 years, of course, after the famous Bobby Fischer-Boris Spassky match with all the controversy around it, all the organizer issues, all of Bobby's complaints, all of Spassky's complaints, and the 1978 match did not shape up to be a smoother run than 1972. Of course, at this time, Viktor Korchnoi had recently very publicly defected from the Soviet Union, a union, of course, Anatoly Karpov was still a part of, and there was definitely some bad blood between the two players. There was a lot of controversy around it, a lot at stake, especially for the Soviet government. They definitely didn't want to see someone who had defected winning the World Chess Championship title. And as a result of this, you got some really interesting characters on each player's side. There was all the usual business of X-raying the chairs and those types of complaints that were quite simply ridiculous. But then also, Anatoly Karpov had quite a number of people in his camp, sort of supporting him for the match. Of course, the players bring a ton of professional chess players to help them. Mikhail Tal, of course, making an appearance in support of Karpov in this match. But also, Karpov very famously had a hypnotist on his team. There was a certified hypnotist who was believed to have these sort of mystical hypnotic powers. And as a result of this, Viktor Korchnoi actually showed up to a game wearing mirrored glasses to reflect back any type of light or perhaps hypnotic stares towards Karpov as a counter to this hypnotist being in Karpov's camp. So a ton of really interesting controversy from the 70s in this one. Korchnoi, by the way, also had some characters in his camp, including there was a visit to his villa during the match by two Americans who were actually out on bail for attempted murder at the time. And the organizers definitely had something to say about that as well, but really, really crazy stuff. And if you guys are ever interested, I definitely would recommend researching and looking up a bit more on this Korchnoi-Karpov match, because it was honestly incredible stuff what they were both doing at the time. And one more bit of fun history for you guys. During one of the matches, very famously, someone from Karpov's team came up and gave Karpov a blueberry yogurt. And of course, Viktor Korchnoi's team said, "That is ridiculous." That was a coded message to help him in his chess game. So if you ever see anybody bring your opponent a blueberry yogurt in your chess game, you are in good company if you accuse them of cheating, with Viktor Korchnoi, of course, being one of chess's all-time legends. Anyways, enough of all that. Let's see what actually happened in this chess game. Here we have Viktor Korchnoi with the white pieces, and aside from all of the historical context around this game, the match itself actually did shape up to be a very exciting contest of the sport. Karpov took an early lead in the match, going up, I believe, 4-1. Quite early on. Then they had some draws, and eventually the score settled at Karpov with 5 wins and Korchnoi with 2. Of course, the match format at this time was not how we sort of know it today, where they play a total number of games and whoever has the better score wins. The match at this time was, of course, a first to 6 wins match. So Karpov up 5-2 with a ton of draws, needed only to win one more game to win the match. And immediately after Karpov achieved this 5-2 score, Korchnoi went on a bit of a tear. And we'll see in this game, he actually managed to level the score at 5-5, leading into the final game. So let's see how Korchnoi did it. He starts with the move 1c4. We see Karpov reply with e6, knight c3, d5, and d4. And perhaps Capablanca would be a bit happier with this development in this game than he was with the Slav. That note just makes me chuckle. All right, knight f6, c takes d5, e takes d5. Bishop g5, normal stuff, bishop e7, e3, kingside castles, bishop d3, knight b d7, and then we see white actually commit this knight to the f3 square. Occasionally you'll see white play the move knight g to e2 these days, and play for some ideas of f3, but knight f3 is perfectly reasonable as well, aiming for more solid control of the e5 square, and sometimes to just plant a knight onto this square. Still though, very, very normal stuff so far. Karpov plays the move rook e8, increasing his control of e4. Queen c2 by white is normal, increasing pressure against a7 and central control. We see c6 now by black, supporting the center. Kingside castles, knight f8. And then Korchnoi actually makes an interesting choice here. He plays the move bishop takes f6, trading this bishop off for a knight. And this is definitely not the most normal trade that you're likely used to seeing in positions like this. Generally, in a lot of beginner games, you'll see a beginner bring out the bishop to g5 or b5, or respectively b4 or g4, and just immediately trade off this bishop for the knight, like it's no big deal. Even trades are even trades. What have I got to lose? Of course, in general, this does tend to be a very bad idea. Why is it a very bad idea? Well, because you tend to actually increase your opponent's activity by drawing this bishop forward. And you're also trading off what could be a useful bishop to contest your opponent's good bishop in exchange for a knight. And a lot of times you can do better for this bishop. You'll see black sort of move this knight out of the way, and white can often trade off black's good bishop for his, quote-unquote bad bishop, despite it being very active. So why does white, in this case, choose to trade off these pieces here? What do you think, chat room? Why does he do it? Why does he do it? Yes, apologies for spoiling the game, but as Brian in the chat says, it has been 42 years. Has been 42 years. So Patrick says the dark squared bishop generally isn't great in the Carlsbad structure for black, and I'm going to have to disagree there. Of course, the Carlsbad structure is the structure we have on the board, where it's symmetrical, aside from the fact that white has an e3 pawn and black has a c6 pawn. Of course, you can get this reversed, and it's very, very similar. And in these structures, of course, one of white's main plans is to go for a minority attack on the queen side of the board. But conversely, this means that black's plans do tend to be sort of on the king's side. And you'll often see black sort of launching attacks by the use of this dark squared bishop. So it can be useful to not allow this bishop to go uncontested. So, of course here, the ideas for white are very, very concrete and very specific. And that's what you tend to see when strong players sort of break principles. They usually have a very concrete, very specific idea behind it, and it usually makes sense when you look at the specific variations. You'll see why it's an exception to the rule. In this case, of course, first and foremost, this bishop is not better on f6 than it was on e7. This bishop would much rather be on this diagonal or this diagonal, where it can effectively pressure the white king side and hamper any minority attacks on the white queen side as well. On f6, as we saw in the first game, it's sort of just staring at a d4 pawn. Aside from that, of course, white is now, by deflecting this bishop, gaining control of the b4 square and can immediately play the move b4, and now his play on the queen side is going to come with a bit more tempo. Aside from that, there is also the point that knight e4 is often going to be an idea for black in these positions, and by removing this knight, he increases his control over the light squares by allowing this bishop to remain on this open diagonal without knight e4 ever being a possibility to shut it out. So bishop takes f6, still not the most common move, but a very, very intuitive move. Sorry, not intuitive, but a very reasonable move when you take into account all of these specific ideas that Korchnoi has. So my word of warning to you is just because you see a strong player do it doesn't mean you should always repeat it, because when you see a strong player break a principle, they normally have very, very specific reasons as to why they're doing it. And in this case, Korchnoi definitely does. So bishop takes f6, and now b4. Black responds by playing bishop to g4, trying to activate his final piece and remove this knight with, of course, some threats of fracturing the white pawns. White plays the natural move, knight to d2. As far as weakening h7, I don't know if that's as relevant as those other reasons I just mentioned. Of course, black did just play the move knight f8, and h7 is going to be defended well enough. But that's another point to mention. h7 is a bit weaker, although white's ideas really are not going to be to checkmate black on the king side. It's going to be for queen side play here. Anyways, in the game, rook to c8 is a natural move, improving the rook, and preparing to fight against any b5 pushes with the move c5, when all of a sudden the bishop on f6 is starting to make a lot more sense, right? So with b5 sort of hampered, now white makes another really interesting decision. He plays the move bishop f5. He's trading off this bishop for this bishop. Now, why would white ever want to do this? Well, the fact of the matter is, white is now going for a total clamp on the dark squares on the black queen side. He's no longer interested in playing the move b5, where this bishop would be quite useful, perhaps, to attack, a weak d5 pawn if this pawn ever moves, to step to this diagonal to attack the black pieces. That's no longer white's idea. After this move rook c8, he wants to shut this bishop out of the game by playing against it on the dark squares, which is a really interesting idea. And so this bishop is really of no use to Korchnoi in this plan. So he plays bishop f5 to trade it off. And we'll see a lot more specifics on how this plan works out as we go here. Bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, and now queen d7 by Karpov. Of course, Karpov with the black pieces up 5-4 in the match, probably okay with trading down into a simpler position. Just wanting to get the white pieces and wanting his shot at victory. Queen takes d7 is played, knight takes d7, and now the lack of space for black might be felt a bit less with queens off the board. Of course, the only natural follow-up to this idea is a4 for white, when now, if black tries something crazy, like a5, white again is not really going to go for b5, which might seem normal, but he can get away with taking on a5 and then targeting the b7 pawn. So a5 not really playable, which means after a normal move, like bishop e7, rook b1, knight f6, there's nothing to stop white from achieving his clamp on the dark squares with the move a5. And from here, I think this is just going to be a very, very pleasant position for white, and Karpov is going to have to work very, very hard not to lose this game. I think black is already in pretty serious danger. That being said, with black, what would you guys in the chat room think to do to try and stay in this game? Any ideas to try to stay in this game with black? There are a couple of resources that you might find pretty interesting here. What to do with black to stay in this game? Why trade queens? Well, in this case, both sides had the reason to trade queens, Andrew. Black, perhaps, I'm speculating here, but maybe black liked his chances to draw a bit better in the end game than with pieces on the board. Black, of course, had less space, and when you do have less space, it can become easier to use the space that you do have with less pieces on the board. In the meantime, white's queen, again, really wasn't going to do much to contribute to his lock on the dark squares, just like the light squared bishop. White's not going for any type of mating attack in this position. His play is on the queen side, and so why not trade queens? Sort of becomes the answer for both sides. So those of you suggesting a6 are playing like Karpov, but I actually don't like this practically for black. It's not necessarily an awful move, it's not the losing move, but practically if you play the move a6, you are giving up on your dark squares essentially forever. This b7 pawn is always going to be a bit of a weakness. If a knight lands on c5, you're never going to be happy capturing it when you open the b file for white's rooks, and you're never going to be happy, committing an entire piece to the sole defense of the b7 pawn. And this is actually what Karpov went for in the game, but again, I don't think practically this is going to give black the best chances of holding on. Believe it or not here, there's a really cool idea of playing the move b5, and while objectively this is still going to be a very tough position for black to hold, I think it does intuitively make sense to try and clarify the position as quickly as possible. The key line to calculate is a takes b6, a takes b6. When after rook a6, black can perhaps consider playing the move c5, trying to open things up for his bishop even more, just trying to break free of this clamp on the dark squares. Alternatively, you can also consider the move b5 here as well. And what's the idea for black in this position? Well, the idea is if you can hold on to the c6 pawn for a few turns and get your knight to a square like c4, c6 is going to be the only weakness in the position, and it's not the easiest weakness for white to attack. And that being said, I do think white has an advantage here, but b5 is always an idea you should sort of consider. And of course, if white does not take on b6, if he plays some type of waiting move, let's say h3, now perhaps a6 by black. And while if you ask any computer, it's going to give a pretty significant edge to white, it's not going to be easy to win anymore, because now all of a sudden your pieces have no way to invade, and c6 is the only weakness. Now, this is sort of more a matter of opinion than a matter of objective evaluation. Either way, black is going to have not the most comfortable position, but I do think this idea of b5 might practically be a bit easier for black to handle with the weakness on c6 rather than on b7. With all that in mind though, Karpov did go for a6, and we'll see how he dealt with the weakness on b7. White wasted no time, immediately bringing this knight to c5. No reason not to. Rook e7 is black's choice for defense. We see king f1, bringing the king to the center. Knight e8, king e2, knight d6, king d3. And once again, we have this type of position where white has a total clamp on the queen side and can sort of improve his pieces at his leisure here, bringing the king all the way into the center. And after rook c to e8, now your goal with white is to find some way to press your advantage for more. So with the white pieces here, say you are Viktor Korchnoi, how can you try to press this game for a win? How can you press this game for a win? AZ says double rooks on the c file. So yeah, black actually does get this knight to d6, which looks like it's in good position to control b7 and to at least keep in mind some active hops as well. But we'll see. It is still white with all the play. So yeah, Danilo, once again, has the right idea. You're not going to make much progress opening up the queen's side. And the reason for that is, as someone in the chat has mentioned, he has locked down the white squares even when white has locked down the dark squares. So it's difficult to play a move like b5 in this position, of course. It's difficult to do it with any meaningful threats. So now is the time for Korchnoi to switch ideas and go back to the center with these ideas of playing f3 or just e4 directly, f3 and e4, or e4 without f3. And this is a very common idea to press for a win in endgames like this. When things are so closed and you have rooks on the board, it's going to be very difficult to make any progress, to invade with any of your pieces, unless you open up at least one avenue for those pieces in the game. And so we'll see now, Korchnoi completely switches sides of the board. He has done what he set out to do on the queen side, locking down this weakness on b7, when black really has no counter weakness to attack. And now he switches to the center in order to open up a file for his rooks. Immediately he plays rook e1, g6 by black, and now rook e2. g6 f6 is the defensive setup that black tries, just trying to control these squares on the 4th rank. White, of course, doubles up. And once again, you'll see black is sort of without active ideas here. So bishop h6, and black is slowly trying to improve his structure, improve his pieces, but white is sort of under no pressure and can continue this attack at his own pace. So knight d to b3 was played, bishop back to f8, knight d2, bishop h6, always repeats. h3 now gets played, king f7, and white improves his structure even more with the move g4. After bishop f8, we actually see the move f3, and white now is fighting for some light squares on the king side, taking away hops from the knight. A good idea in any position, middle game, end game, or otherwise, just taking away the knight's forward moves. And then we see after rook d8, knight d3, knight b5, rook f1, bishop h6, white continues pressing with the move f4, which might not be what you guys expected, but Korchnoi is just trying to take as much space as he can before he decides to open up the position with e4. Bishop f8 now comes on the board. We see knight back to d2, knight back to d6, rook back to e1, h6, rook back to f1. Just some waiting moves here, nothing too special. Rook b8, rook a1, rook e8, rook e1, rook b8, and now finally Korchnoi opens the position with the move e4. This had to be done at some point for white to try to win the game, and Korchnoi decided now was the correct time. D takes e4 with check, of course, is played. Knight d takes e4. Knight b5, and now knight c3. One pair of rooks comes off the board, and now black decides to take off the knight for the bishop as well, and plays the move rook d8. So, chat room, let's see if you can find white to move and play for an advantage here. White to move and play for an advantage. I guess this move isn't so hard to find because it's sort of an only move. Sort of an only move here. So, of course, the move I'm talking about is going to be the move knight takes b5. No other move really to defend the d-pawn, but we'll see that it is going to be white playing for an advantage in this endgame. The reason for that is all down to the position of the kings. White's king is active and centralized, and black's king is not. In order to keep it that way, Korchnoi plays a very accurate move here, and that is the move f5, removing any active ideas for this king, creating sort of this wall on the 6th rank that the black king cannot penetrate through, as well as this covering squares on the e file. G takes f5 was played, G takes f5, and now black tries for activity through rook to g8. And so once again, chat room, let's see if you can find out how to press this position for an advantage with white. So yeah, the chat is asking about e4. White's going for e4 in order to create more weaknesses. Not necessarily. White is going for e4 not because it creates a ton of weaknesses for black, but it gives his pieces an avenue into the position, right? His pieces were sort of trapped behind his own pawns and behind enemy pawns. And so with e4, he opens up the position enough to induce some trades and start fighting for more. So some guesses are coming in here. Rook e3 is actually not going to be the answer in this case. After rook e3, you might get hit with rook a8, and you might find this a pawn is not the killer that you want it to be. So those of you saying king c3 are playing like Korchnoi. Unfortunately for you, Korchnoi did not play the most accurate move in this position. King c3, though, is a very interesting try, and we'll see how it worked out for Korchnoi. I think perhaps best would be either the move rook e6 or rook a2, with a very similar idea. The idea is to go after this c6 pawn for black. For example, rook e6, rook g3 check, king e4, takes, and then the key move here is going to be the move d5. What's the point of d5? Well, the point is you better be very, very careful about capturing this guy. King d4, for example, we don't actually care so much about the d5 pawn. Rook h1, and now there are some ideas of c6, creating passed pawn, but in this case, after rook h1, rook b6 is best when all of the black pawns on the queen side fall, and white is left with two passed pawns on the a file and the c file. Rook a2, again, has a similar idea of rook g3 check, king e4, takes, and the move a6, when now after takes, c6 is going to be weak, and again, white is going to end up with a couple passed pawns. Korchnoi in the game, though, does go king c3, and the idea now after something like rook g3 was to bring the king up to b4. Karpov, perhaps a little bit afraid of this, goes for rook e8, offering up a trade of the rooks. Now, as we are a bit short on time, I will not ask you to totally calculate out this king and pawn endgame. I think it should be a draw from what I could tell, but still complicated stuff. Instead, Korchnoi just keeps the rook on the board with the move rook d2, which is perfectly reasonable. Rook e4 now was Karpov's attempt at finding counterplay. King b4 is natural, bringing the king to the queen side, and after king to e8, of course now, what is the winning idea for white? Last question for you guys, chat. What is white's idea to try to win the game? I said winning idea. It's not necessarily a winning position yet for white, but this is sort of the only attempt left for white to play for an advantage. Only way left for white to play for the advantage. Of course, I am talking about the move pawn to a6. Sacrificing this a pawn in an attempt to give your king a route into the position where it can actively try and escort its own pawns to the end of the board. This pawn, of course, must be captured with b takes a6, and now after king a5, king d7. Don't make the mistake of capturing this guy. You're not interested in the a pawn, you're interested in making your c pawn a queen, which means king d6 is the better move. Karpov now played accurately for some time. b4 is the only idea for black to stay in this game. You have to sort of race white to the edge of the board, white pushing a c pawn and black pushing a b pawn. b4 is the only way to do it. Now, of course, d5 is the breakthrough tactic that white needed. We see cd5. And now, rather than c6, which would allow the king to come to d6 and the rook to come behind the pawn, we see rook takes d5 first, king c8, and now rook d3 to keep an eye on black's b pawn and keep everything sort of locked down. And now, finally, Karpov does start to slip. He needed to play the move rook c4, I believe, to stay behind white's passed pawn, and instead he pushes a5, which, of course, looks very natural, but allows white to start playing for the advantage with the killer move, rook g3. And now you can sort of apply the same principles that you apply in a pure rook and pawn versus rook endgame. The white king has gotten to the 6th rank. The black rook cannot check from behind. And c6 is going to be sort of a devastating threat here with checkmate to follow. Or, in fact, we'll see a different threat be just as devastating for black to deal with in the game. In the game, Karpov tries the move b3, which is sort of a vain attempt to get the rook to come back to take on b3, when rook b4 check would be a nice little sneaky victory by Karpov. But rook g8 check instead was not played, but rather king c6 is the only winning move by Viktor Korchnoi, forcing the king out from in front of the pawn. Otherwise, checkmate will be played. Of course, if rook e8, then this is just a free pawn. So king b8 was tried. Now white can capture this one with check, king to a7, and now the black king gets further evicted by some rook checks. We see the king get out of the way of the pawn, and with black's b pawn now fallen, black does not have any counterplay, and the white c pawn will be victorious in the game. A4 is played, white snaps off another f pawn, rook f4, white snaps off an h pawn, and after a3, we see check and takes, and after rook takes f5, of course this endgame is just completely losing, down 2 pawns for Karpov. After rook g3, rook f6, rook g8 check, king c7 check, king c8, rook h7, keeping an eye on this pawn and preparing to push it all the way up the board, while keeping the threat of the c pawn, of course. Black went ahead and resigned in this position. Of course, there's just simply nothing to be done for Karpov. And so with this game, Viktor Korchnoi leveled the match at 5-5. However, it was not meant to be. Of course, this was game 31 in the match when Korchnoi won, and unfortunately for him, it was all over by game 32. Karpov coming back in the very next game with a victory to end the match before any more controversy could happen. Perhaps the blueberry yogurt was victorious after all. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this edition of the Road to 2000, where I went over a little bit more of chess history. I know we spent a long time on each of these games, but there was a lot to talk about, and of course a lot of context to provide as well. If you liked it, I might do a part 2 with some more controversial games. Just let me know what you guys thought. As always, if you're watching live, we do have the endgame class coming up right after this, where I'm going to show you how to fight for the win with even material, usually by having some kind of space advantage. If you're watching the video version and that's it for you, you're all chessed out, thank you so much for joining me. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.